Hi, aviation operations students. Welcome to week 2. This is take 8 or 9, but hopefully we can get you a lecture that actually has audio and video coordinated. Because of some technical difficulties, I'm using Zoom and then posting it. So there may be a few hiccups here and there, but I will try and do my best. So for our first lecture of the week, our day 1 lecture, section 1, aviation history. So we'll be taking a look at aviation history, 3,000 years in about 15 minutes. So let's take a look at the history of aviation, 3,000 years in hopefully less than 15 minutes. Technology has moved very quickly. We look at an example here, just grabbing 60 years in aviation, the first powered flight, 1903, Orville Wright, or was it Gustav Whitehead, or was it? In reality, we do know that in the first few years of the 20th century, by various definitions, powered flight became a reality. A short 60 years later, the X-15 flew to 106,000 meters, qualifying as human spaceflight, and the SR-71 flew to high altitudes at over Mach 3. So let's go back to the earliest recorded comments of aviation vehicles, and that would be kites. About 1,000 before the current era, kites were invented in China. And there is a story that in 559 AD, Chinese prisoners, including a prince, escaped from a tower that was a jail by kite. And the father of King Lear tried to imitate the Greeks in their flying, and it didn't go well. By the 15th century through the 18th century, people were designing any number of flying machines, gliders, parachutes, helicopters, planes with flapping wings, things that potentially were forerunners of hot air balloons. Many of them some of them would fly. Some of Leonardo da Vinci's sketches of helicopters are very close to what we have nowadays, and others, for example, this one here, very impractical. But at least it was a beginning of an idea of how aviation might work. And in 1783, the Montgolfier brothers demonstrated the first hot air balloon in France. And in 1811, the tailor from Ulm designed a glider. And the day before in his practice flight, he had a marvelous flight, but it cooled down the next day. So when he went to fly along the Danube, there were no thermals and his demo was a flop. In 1853, George Cayley designed and built the first working piloted glider that was actually built. And again, in 1903, the Wright brothers, over 100 years ago. And this was the technology that they had. Within 10 years, the first dogfights were occurring as pilots shot at each other with handguns in the siege of Naco in Mexico. And then World War I started, And airplanes technology grew very quickly, from dogfights with people shooting at each other by handguns from aircraft like this to the Red Baron at the end of the war. And even early bombing, dropping bombs from hot air balloons or aircraft, basically just picking up the bomb and dropping it. Once the war was over and there were airplanes out there and we needed to use them somehow, domestic US airmail began between Washington, Philadelphia, and New York. This is the Eastern Corridor. But eventually it went all the way across the continent. And we'll be looking at this and some other historic elements as part of your homework. I'll be asking you to identify some timeline elements, and I will build a more complex timeline in a shared note. So it is important for you to have access to those shared notes. Early navigation aids, not very fancy. An early sectional. 1927, Charles Lindbergh was able to fly nonstop across the Atlantic, and 5 years later, Amelia Earhart as well. And then came World War II. The Hindenburg was thought to be a really great idea until it wasn't. But what really developed during World War II was jet engines. So the V-1 buzz bomb was launched in 1944. And again, when you see this megaphone, I encourage you to stop and think about this. Why is the history of warfare so relevant to aviation? Why did we have these huge jumps in technology? And the V-2 rocket, the first long-range guided ballistic missile. The London bomb hits through the Blitz left a great deal of devastation. So towards the beginning of the war, we have the Heinkel, the first practical jet aircraft, a little bit beyond what we were seeing, and a jet engine. And by the time you get to the end of the war, we're looking at a much more complex jet-powered fighter aircraft. The Boeing P-12 and the Mustang. Again, a big jump in technology, and the first time that we're starting to see heavy aircraft. So we had the war in Europe, and then with Pearl Harbor, the war in the Pacific began. And the US was able to take advantage while they sent people who could be soldiers off to war. Those who could not serve in the war went to the factories, women, men, a variety of people that kept manufacturing running. And then we had the fall of Berlin in the spring of 1945 and the end of the war in Europe. But the war continued in the Pacific. Many of these islands belonged or were associated with Japan. The flag raising at Iwo Jima. Maintenance fields that may not be as fancy as one might expect in a clean hangar. Kind of a nice environment. And then the Enola Gay. The bomb dropped at Hiroshima, ended the war in the Pacific. But in the aftermath of the war in Europe, the US scooped up the rocket guys, and they were used to design missile systems to use for weapons, and also our launch systems that eventually led us to go into space. Now we were in the jet age, where jet engines were in wide use. The X-planes that took us to high altitudes and high speeds, and Chuck Yeager breaking the speed of sound in the glamorous Glennis. First jet-powered Air Force One, the Boeing 707, which was in wide use. And then eventually, our supersonic aircraft, first used for cargo and then for passengers. And then they kind of phased out, though there is talk about bringing them back again. The 707 really made it possible to have international travel on a much wider scale. So the jet engine provided new opportunities and new challenges. Longer range without stops for refueling. Higher noise levels. Longer runways. They could no longer land and take off at any runway that was out there. New fuel requirements and needing a lot of that new fuel. Traffic mix in the patterns. Everything from small propeller aircraft to the large jets. It's something that you experience here at Gallatin Field, but it was something very new. And consider the other changes that the jet engine brought to aviation. And the space race, bringing Wernher von Braun to the United States, ended up with us blasting off towards the moon, landing, and returning people safely to the surface of the Earth. As the industry grew and the availability of aircraft continued, we had some great economic booms, and that included the post-World War II boom, as the baby boomers were starting to grow up, and we all of a sudden have money in the 60s and 70s. a recession in the late 70s into the early 80s, but that was followed by the dot-com boom. Being able to experience flight became something that happened more commonly, whether it was traveling the world or learning how to fly, or buying your own aircraft, or having your business buy or charter your own aircraft. And that brought about the FBO. So as you travel along the highways, you run into the travel plazas, and they have gas stations that have food and everything else you can think of. That was the FBO, starting out as mom and pop shops, mostly run by aviation fans who just wasn't necessarily worried about making a lot of money, mostly just wanting to be part of the aviation community. With time, that's changed, and we'll be talking about it as we go along this semester. So I ask you to think, as you think back on this history, as we look forward through the legal history that's coming up in the next couple chapters, how war and conflict have advanced aviation. And I'll be asking you to consider these questions in your homework assignment. So next up, we will continue history, but we will be looking at the legal history of aviation and the events associated with that, and the 9 freedoms, including the 9 freedoms of the air. Thank you very much. And hopefully this version works out, and I will work on getting the other 2 lectures up as well, and then I will try and work out the bugs we've happened. Thank you very much for bearing with me and for your patience as we get all these things worked out and get you what you need to for your course. This is the end of the day 1 mini lecture. Next up will be day 2, the legal history 1 and 2.